The iron prongs of the heavy pitchfork vibrated violently in Clara's hands as the lead wolf lunged through the blinding snow. A low, savage snarl sliced through the howling winter wind, and she swung the tool with every ounce of strength in her large, heavy-set frame. The sharp metal connected with the beast's jaw, sending it tumbling backward into the deep, crimson-stained drifts. Behind her, collapsed against the trunk of a dying pine tree, lay the massive, unmoving body of a stranger. Blood soaked through his expensive leather coat, steaming slightly in the freezing mountain air as a pack of 5 more winter wolves circled them like shadows. Clara wiped the sweat and flying ice from her eyes with the back of her sleeve, her breath coming in ragged, heavy gasps. Her threadbare coat strained against her broad shoulders and full arms as she repositioned her grip on the frozen wooden handle. Another wolf sprang from the left, its yellow teeth snapping just inches from her thigh. She pivoted her weight, planting her heavy boots deep into the ice, and slammed the butt of the pitchfork into the animal's ribs. The wolf yelped, but its sharp claws caught the fabric of her skirt, tearing the cheap wool away and exposing her thick, scarred calf to the biting frost. She did not cry out, because the frontier had beaten the tears out of her a long time ago. Instead, she let out a fierce, guttural growl that sounded almost as feral as the predators surrounding her. The massive cowboy on the ground stirred slightly, his long legs twitching as his bloodshot eyes cracked open beneath the brim of his snow-dusted hat. He looked up through a haze of pain, his gaze freezing on the full-figured woman who stood between him and certain death. Clara raised the pitchfork high, her large silhouette blocking out the dim winter sun, looking like an ancient, unstoppable goddess of the mountains. With a final, desperate surge of power, she drove the iron prongs directly into the chest of the largest wolf as it leaped for her throat. The beast thrashed, dying instantly, and the remaining pack members hesitated, their ears flattening before they turned and vanished into the whiteout. Clara collapsed to her knees, the heavy pitchfork slipping from her numb, trembling fingers. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she crawled through the freezing snow toward the wounded giant. His face was pale, his lips blue from the creeping frost, but his intense, dark eyes remained fixed on her face. He didn't look at her heavy jaw or her large body with the disgust she was so terribly used to. With the last of his fading strength, the dying man reached up, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against her frozen cheek. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, and whispered a single shocking sentence that made Clara's entire world stand still in the freezing wilderness. Before we reveal the shocking words he whispered that changed her life forever, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment of this breathtaking story. "I know who you are, Clara," the dying man whispered, his voice a low, gravelly scrape that cut right through the freezing wind. "Don't let them win." His hand went limp, dropping from her cheek and thudding heavily into the snow as his eyes rolled back into his head. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of his words sank into her chest. He knew her name, but there was no time to figure out how or why. She grabbed the collar of his heavy leather coat, leaning her weight back and pulling with all the strength in her broad shoulders. The cowboy was a giant, his muscular frame easily weighing over 200 pounds, and his boots plowed deep, heavy trenches through the thick white drifts. Every step was pure agony as Clara forced her large body to move forward against the blinding blizzard. Her thighs burned, rubbing together beneath her torn skirt, and her breath tore out of her lungs in ragged, burning gasps. The townspeople of Oakhaven had always called her a useless, clumsy heifer, claiming her thick frame was just a drain on the town's winter rations. They had thrown ruined, moldy flour sacks at her feet and laughed her out of the mercantile, forcing her into this frozen exile. But right now, it was that exact same heavy density and raw physical power that kept her moving through the deadly storm. A smaller, thinner woman would have collapsed under the weight of the unconscious man minutes ago. Clara pushed through the final thicket of pines, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as the dark, rotting wood of her small cabin finally appeared through the whiteout. She dragged the giant up the 2 wooden steps of the porch, the old boards groaning loudly under their combined weight. With one final desperate heave, she kicked the heavy cabin door open and pulled him inside, slamming the wood shut against the howling wilderness. The silence inside the cabin was sudden and deafening, broken only by the sound of her own desperate, wheezing breath. She dropped to the floor beside him, her trembling, frost-bitten hands immediately going to the buckles of his blood-soaked leather coat. As she pulled the stiff material away, she saw the true horror of his wound. A jagged, deep gash tore across his ribs, the flesh angry and purple, oozing fresh crimson blood that stained his expensive wool shirt. Clara pushed herself up, her large body moving with a sudden, focused urgency as she rushed toward her small wood stove. She threw 3 heavy logs into the embers, blowing on them until a bright, warm orange glow illuminated the dark, freezing room. She filled a battered tin pot with clean snow and set it on the hot iron, her hands shaking as she grabbed her last jar of dried mountain herbs. This cabin was a place of isolation and bitter memories, a shack where she had spent the last 2 years hiding her large body from the cruel whispers and mocking stares of the world. But looking down at the pale, handsome face of the dying stranger, Clara knew her loneliness was over, at least for tonight. Clara gripped the edge of the heavy wooden bed frame, planting her boots firmly against the floorboards as she prepared to lift the unconscious giant. She wrapped her thick, strong arms around his massive torso, pulling his upper body upward with a deep, guttural groan. His dead weight strained her back, but she refused to let her grip slip. With one final, explosive heave of her broad shoulders, she rolled his large frame onto the mattress. The old ropes beneath the straw ticking creaked loudly under his immense size. Silas let out a sharp, ragged gasp of pain as his head hit the pillow, a fresh line of dark crimson blood soaking through his torn shirt. Clara didn't hesitate, tearing the ruined fabric away to expose the deep, jagged wound cutting across his ribs. The flesh was hot to the touch, pulsing with a dangerous, angry fever that threatened to take his life before the sun rose. She rushed back to the stove, grabbing the boiling tin pot with a thick rag. The steam carried the sharp, medicinal scent of crushed golden seal and wild willow bark into the small room. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, her large thighs pressing against the cold floorboards as she dipped a clean strip of linen into the scalding water. As she pressed the hot cloth against the oozing gash, Silas's entire body went rigid, his massive hands convulsively gripping the edges of her blanket. He let out a low, animalistic growl of agony, his jaw clenching so hard that Clara feared his teeth would shatter. "Stay still," she murmured, her voice soft but commanding, as she used her heavy weight to pin his shoulder down. "If you fight me, you'll bleed to death before the fever even has a chance to take you." Silas's dark eyes flew open, bloodshot and glassy with delirium, staring directly into hers. For a terrifying second, he didn't see a savior. He saw a threat. His large, calloused hand flying up to clamp around her thick wrist like a band of solid iron. His grip was painfully tight, bruising her flesh, but Clara did not flinch or pull away. She looked down at him with steady, unyielding brown eyes, completely unfazed by his raw physical power. "I am not going to hurt you, Cowboy," she said softly, her thumb gently brushing against his knuckles until the tension slowly drained from his massive arm. His hand slid down, his eyes closing again as he sank back into the dark depths of unconsciousness. For 3 long, agonizing days and nights, the blizzard outside battered the small wooden cabin, and for 3 days, Clara did not sleep. She watched over him like a sentinel, changing his hot bandages every few hours and wiping the freezing sweat from his broad forehead. Her own stomach rumbled with a hollow, painful ache, but she ignored it, pouring every remaining drop of her scarce winter broth down his throat. She fed him spoonful by spoonful, her steady hands supporting his heavy neck while she went completely without food herself. By the third evening, the fierce wind outside finally died down into a deadly, freezing silence. Clara sat in her rocking chair by the fading embers of the stove, her eyelids heavy as she stared at her worn, calloused palms. She was exhausted, her large body aching from the relentless strain of nursing a man twice her size. A low, deep rumble from the bed suddenly broke the silence of the room. Where am I?" Silas grunted, his voice incredibly rough, like boots dragging across coarse gravel. Clara turned her head quickly, watching as the giant slowly pushed himself up on one elbow, the blanket falling away to reveal the clean, neatly stitched bandage wrapping his wide chest. His eyes were no longer wild with fever. They were clear, sharp, and intensely focused on her full-figured silhouette. "You are safe," Clara said softly, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the dying embers. "You are in the mountains, 3 miles north of Oakhaven." Silas blinked against the dim light, his gaze tracking from his neatly bandaged ribs up to Clara's face. He didn't flinch, and he didn't give her that familiar, cutting look of disgust that she had come to expect from every man in the territory. Instead, a profound, heavy silence filled the cabin as his dark eyes traveled over her broad shoulders and her full, soft face. He looked at her the way a man looks at an oasis after weeks in the desert. "You dragged me out of the snow," Silas said, his deep voice vibrating through the small room as he tested the strength in his arms. "You fought off those winter wolves alone." Clara shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her cheeks flushing a deep pink as she looked down at her worn apron. "I did what any decent soul would do, stranger. You were dying." "The name is Silas Vance," he said, pushing his large legs over the edge of the bed with a low groan. "And I don't forget a debt, Clara." Hearing her name on his lips again made her heart skip a beat, the memory of his whispered words in the snow rushing back to her. She watched in disbelief as he reached into his heavy leather coat, which she had dried by the fire, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound document sealed with a gold stamp. "I am not a drifter," Silas said, looking directly into her eyes, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I own the Blackwood gold mines on the other side of the valley." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized who was sitting on her modest bed. Silas Vance was the most powerful, untouchable man in the entire Northern Territory, a billionaire rancher and tycoon who answered to no one. "The people in Oakhaven are fools," Silas growled, his jaw tightening as he noticed the thin, threadbare blanket on her lap and the empty broth pot on the stove. "They threw you out here to freeze because they couldn't see the worth of a true woman." He stood up, his massive frame towering over her, though he swayed slightly from the residual weakness in his muscles. He walked over to her, his large, warm hand extending toward her smaller, trembling fingers. "Pack whatever small things you care for," Silas commanded gently, his voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You are never spending another cold night in this miserable shack." Clara looked up at him, her large eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Silas, I am a large woman. The townspeople say I am an eyesore, a burden. If you take me with you, they will laugh at you too." Silas leaned down, his face just inches from hers, his dark eyes burning with an ancient, protective fury. "Let them try," he whispered fiercely. "I am taking you to my estate, Clara. From this day forward, you are under my protection." The iron-shod wheels of Silas's heavy black carriage crunched loudly through the packed ice of the estate's grand courtyard. Clara stared out the frosted glass window, her breath fogging the pane as the massive stone walls of the Vance Manor loomed over them like a fortress. The warmth inside the carriage was a luxury she had never known, fueled by heated bricks wrapped in thick velvet at her feet. Silas sat across from her, his broad shoulders easily filling the leather bench, his dark eyes never leaving her face as the carriage ground to a halt. He stepped out first, his heavy boots thudding against the snow, and immediately turned to offer her his massive gloved hand. Clara hesitated, her large fingers looking small against his palm as he guided her down the steps with absolute care. The manor doors flew open, and a line of servants stood at attention, their eyes widening slightly as they took in Clara's full-figured frame and torn, winter-stained clothes. "This is Clara," Silas announced, his deep voice echoing across the stone courtyard with a sharp, warning edge that made every servant instantly drop their gaze. "Her word is law in this house. Prepare the master suite and bring the hearths to a full roar." He walked her through the massive oak doors into a grand hallway lined with burning crystal chandeliers that cast a golden light over everything. Clara felt acutely aware of her size as her heavy winter boots left wet, muddy tracks on the polished marble floors, but Silas simply kept his hand on the small of her back, guiding her forward. They reached a towering parlor where 3 of the territory's most expensive, high-end tailors were already waiting, surrounded by rolls of imported silk, heavy velvet, and measuring tapes. The lead tailor, a thin, sharp-faced man from the city, took one look at Clara's wide hips and full bust, and a tiny, judgmental smirk twitched at the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Vance, you did not specify the unique proportions of the lady," the tailor said, his voice dripping with condescension as he tapped his fingers against his brass tape. "A silhouette of this magnitude requires a great deal of structure, perhaps a heavy, rigid corset to minimize the—" "You will not minimize a single thing," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying rumble that made the tailor freeze instantly. Silas stepped forward, his massive frame completely eclipsing the smaller man, his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. He reached out and grabbed a massive roll of deep, emerald green velvet from the table, tossing it directly at the tailor's chest. "You will throw away the corsets," Silas commanded, his dark eyes burning with an intense, fierce pride as he looked back at Clara's curvy form. "You will use the finest silk and the heaviest velvet to drape every single curve of her body exactly as it is. If she complains about a single seam being too tight, I will buy your entire shop just to burn it to the ground." The tailor went pale, nodding frantically as his hands began to shake against the fabric. Clara stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. But for the first time in her entire life, the heat in her cheeks wasn't from shame. It was from a deep, intoxicating rush of pure validation. Silas walked over to her, his large, warm hand gently cupping her chin to lift her gaze until she was looking directly into his intense eyes. "You are a magnificent woman, Clara," he whispered, his thumb brushing over her soft cheek with a tenderness that made her knees feel weak. "The fools in Oakhaven tried to make you feel small because they are small men. I am going to make sure they never forget your name." He turned away, his face hardening back into stone as he grabbed his heavy gun belt from the velvet chair and buckled it around his waist. "Rest now," Silas said, checking the chambers of his heavy Colt revolver with a cold, metallic click. "I have some business to settle in town regarding the men who left you to starve in that forest." The heavy wooden doors of the Oakhaven Mercantile slammed open with a force that rattled the glass panes in their frames. The bitter winter wind howled into the warm shop, carrying with it a swirl of powdery snow and the massive, terrifying shadow of Silas Vance. The low chatter inside the store died instantly as the floorboards groaned beneath Silas's heavy, deliberate strides. Behind the long oak counter stood Edgar Miller, the wealthy merchant who had led the townspeople in mocking Clara, his face turning the color of curdled milk as he recognized the gold tycoon. Beside him stood the town sheriff, a crooked man with a silver star pinned carelessly to his dirty sheepskin vest. "Mr. Vance," Edgar stammered. frantically wiping his sweaty hands on his white apron as he stepped backward. We didn't expect you back from the mountains so soon. There were rumors you'd been killed by the wolves you left me to?" Silas interrupted, his voice dropping into a low, murderous register that filled every corner of the room. He didn't stop until he was mere inches from the counter, his towering frame casting a dark, suffocating shadow over the trembling shopkeeper. Silas placed his massive hands flat on the polished wood, leaning forward until his intense, dark eyes burned directly into Edgar's soul. "You threw Clara out into the wilderness," Silas whispered, each word cutting through the silence like a razor blade. "You called her a drain on your pathetic rations. And you let your men throw garbage at her feet because she didn't fit into your miserable little view of the world." The sheriff cleared his throat, his hand hovering nervously over the butt of his pistol as he stepped forward. "Now see here, Vance. The big girl was a public nuisance. She didn't have the coin to pay her debts, and the town voted to—" In a movement so fast it was barely a blur, Silas's right hand flew out, grabbing the front of the sheriff's heavy vest and slamming him face first into the thick oak counter. The glass display case beneath them shattered into 1,000 glittering shards, and the sheriff let out a sharp, choked cry of agony as Silas pinned him down with one iron-like forearm. With his free hand, Silas slowly unbuckled his heavy leather gun belt and let it thud onto the counter, exposing the raw, terrifying power of his bare hands. "I am the debt collector now," Silas growled, his jaw clenching as he reached into his vest and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents tied with a black ribbon. He slammed the papers down onto Edgar's wet counter, right next to the sheriff's bleeding nose. "I have just purchased every single mortgage, land deed, and supply credit in Oakhaven," Silas announced, a cold, brutal smile touching his lips. "As of 10 minutes ago, Edgar, you don't own this building. You don't own the flour in your barrels, and you don't own the dirt beneath your boots. Every cent you make belongs to my estate." Edgar fell to his knees behind the counter, his hands shaking violently as he looked up at the man who had just destroyed his life with a single stroke of a pen. "Please, Mr. Vance, I have a family. We didn't know the full-figured girl meant anything to you." "She is the woman who saved my life," Silas roared, his voice shaking the timber beams of the ceiling as he released the sheriff and shoved him into the dirt. "And by the end of this week, every single one of you miserable cowards will drop to your knees in the mud and beg her for forgiveness." The morning of the town's winter gala arrived with a blinding, diamond-like glare over the snow-covered valley. Clara stood before the towering gold-leaf mirror in the master suite, her breath catching as she looked at the reflection of the woman staring back at her. The city tailors had done exactly as Silas commanded, abandoning the bone-crushing corsets entirely. Instead, yards of heavy, emerald-green velvet flowed seamlessly over her wide hips, while a rich silk lining hugged her deep, full bust like a protective glove. The deep color made her eyes look like warm amber, and for the first time in her 30 years of life, Clara did not look at her large frame and wish she could disappear. The heavy bedroom door groaned open, and Silas walked in, dressed in a tailored black wool suit that accentuated his massive, muscular shoulders. He stopped dead in his tracks, his dark eyes widening as they swept over every single curve and lush line of her body. A heavy, thick silence filled the room as he walked toward her, his boots thudding softly against the thick Persian rug. "I have seen the finest ladies in Chicago and New York, Clara," Silas murmured, his deep voice carrying a gravelly warmth that made her skin tingle. "But not a single one of them could hold a candle to the woman standing in front of me right now." He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently resting on her wide waist, his thumbs tracing the soft velvet over her hips with an intense, unyielding reverence. Clara leaned into his touch, her heart hammering against her ribs as she felt the sheer, protective heat radiating from his massive body. "They are waiting for us in town," Silas whispered, his jaw tightening into a hard, dangerous line as he looked toward the window. And it's time to show them who owns the frontier. The town hall of Oakhaven was bursting with warmth and the smell of roasting meats when the grand double doors were suddenly thrown open to the freezing night air. The laughter and clinking of glasses died instantly as the townspeople turned, their mouths dropping open in absolute shock. Clara walked in first, her head held high, her full-figured silhouette radiating an undeniable, breathtaking power in the glittering light of the chandeliers. Beside her, holding her hand with an iron grip, was Silas Vance, his dark eyes scanning the room like a hawk looking for prey. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, a suffocating silence falling over the wealthy merchants and women who had just days ago called Clara an eyesore and a stray dog. Edgar Miller stood near the punch bowl, his face turning entirely gray as he looked at the expensive green velvet gown that cost more than his entire winter inventory. "You all remember Clara?" Silas's voice boomed across the rafters, dropping the temperature in the room to absolute zero. "The woman you judged, the woman you starved, and the woman you left to be torn apart by the mountain wolves." He stepped forward, his massive frame completely cutting off Edgar's path to the exit as the merchant tried to slip away into the shadows. Silas grabbed Edgar by the collar of his fine wool coat, his arm flexing with terrifying raw strength as he dragged the man to the center of the hardwood floor. "Get down," Silas commanded, his voice a low, murderous growl that rattled the glass lamps on the walls. "Mr. Vance, please," Edgar whimpered, looking around at the silent, terrified townspeople who refused to even look him in the eye. "I apologize. We didn't know." "You will not apologize to me," Silas roared, slamming his heavy boot onto the floor just inches from Edgar's hands. "You will drop to your knees in front of the true queen of this valley, and you will beg her for the very air you breathe." Edgar collapsed onto his knees, his hands shaking violently against the polished wood as he looked up at Clara's towering, beautiful figure. One by one, under the freezing, deadly glare of Silas Vance, the other merchants and the crooked sheriff dropped to their knees beside him, their heads bowed in total defeat. Clara looked down at them, her broad shoulders straight, her full bust rising and falling with a slow, steady dignity that completely filled the room. She felt Silas's hand slide into hers, his fingers locking with hers, his presence an absolute shield against the cruelty of the world. "This valley belongs to her now," Silas announced to the silent room, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Every home you live in, every business you run, and every piece of gold pulled from the earth is hers." He turned to Clara, his hard face softening into pure, unadulterated devotion as he lifted her hand and pressed a deep, lingering kiss against her knuckles. "My empire is yours, Clara," Silas whispered, his dark eyes promising a lifetime of safety and love, "and no one will ever make you feel small again." Now, dear listeners, as Clara stands triumphant at the side of her fierce protector, we have one final question for you. If you were in Clara's shoes, could you truly forgive the townspeople who wronged you, or would you let Silas destroy them completely? Let us know in the comments below.